Hello, hello, and welcome to our Small Business HR series. This webinar is being brought to you by hranswers.org, and our topic today is wage and hour compliance. And so we are going to be going through a series of facts and information that are relevant to small business owners everywhere based on federal regulations and our journeys and travels in human resources. So welcome to our training for today. Again, this session is being presented to you by hranswers.org, which is an Arizona-based HR consulting firm that specializes in providing guidance and compliance support and training specifically to small business leaders. And we do what we do so that our clients can focus on really important things like growing their businesses and increasing their profits. So if there's any way that we can help you specifically following this session, please don't hesitate to reach out. We'll be waiting to hear from you. And today, I'd like to introduce myself quickly. I am your facilitator, Niki Ramirez, and I am the founder and principal consultant at HR Answers, again, based in Arizona, and dedicated to providing really practical and impactful HR support for small business leaders. We really do our work with an eye on helping employers and small business owners work in partnership with their employees to design and implement different types of HR programs that really help produce maximum results in their organizations. So please, again, reach out to me today following this session with your most pressing HR question, and we'll see what we can do to get you the help that you deserve. A quick note before we get into the meat and potatoes for today, but this session has been prepared specifically to educate small business leaders on areas of wage and hour compliance and shouldn't be construed as legal advice. And of course, our team is connected to many expert labor and employment attorneys. And if you are anywhere across the country and find yourself needing support from an HR, labor and employment perspective, and need an attorney contact, please let us know and we'll be happy to provide a referral. All right, so let's see here. What's our journey going to be today? Let's get a little map together of what we're going to cover. So the first thing that we're going to delve into is going to be talking about wage and hour laws for small businesses, kind of how they came to be. And we're going to specifically spend some time talking about the difference between exempt and non-exempt employees. We're also going to spend some time talking about basic requirements that clients often ask us about with regard to the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is our big overarching wage and hour law at the federal level. So we're going to talk about minimum wage and overtime rules, and we'll also talk about what constitutes compensable time, or time that has to be paid to your employees versus time that maybe is off the clock. So we'll talk about that. We're also going to spend some time talking about the impact of technology on compliance, and I'm going to share with you a sample telecommuting policy too that you may be able to adopt, edit, and use in your business. I also want to make you aware of some important record-keeping requirements, and I also want to share with you where you can go if you need more help. So to get started, the Fair Labor Standards Act is, again, it's a federal law that's enforced in the United States by the U.S. Department of Labor. It was initially signed and enacted in 1938, and currently, 2019, there are more than 130 million workers, full and part-time, that are covered under the Fair Labor Standards Act. And the Fair Labor Standards Act is a law that, for the most part, applies to each and every business across the United States. And in the beginning, this is a little bit of history that I find interesting and thought I would share. In 1938, when the FLSA was originally signed, it had a couple of main areas of focus. And so the first one was to do away with oppressive child labor practices. So child labor laws came into the landscape. It also set a minimum hourly wage. So the first hourly wage in the US was 25 cents an hour, and it capped a maximum work week at 44 hours. So things have changed quite a bit since then. One of the major provisions that we've seen over time, so this is an update to the 1938 law, of course, but over time we've added different provisions under the Fair Labor Standards Act. And for small business owners, the idea of exempt versus non-exempt employees is a really key point to understand. So federal employment laws in the United States really, it does not place any type of limitation on the working hours for employees, but it does tell us, based on the type of job that your employee performs, how we should pay them. So we'll talk about how to classify exempt and non-exempt employees properly. And if you or someone in your business would like to dig in and talk about how to classify an employee in a certain position, we can certainly do that as a follow-up project. Of note, I wanted to stop here and pause and mention that several states do have requirements that limit the number of hours that an employee can work in a particular day or in a 7-day time frame. And so it's important to make sure to stop and check your state laws to make sure that if there are any additional regulations at the state level or local level, that you take those into consideration in your small business. And before I move on, just a quick point of comparison here. So the European Union member states, like Germany, for example, have a practice of limiting weekly work hours to 35 hours. And so that's something to think about, right? When we have employees in our small businesses, when we think about the larger picture, the global picture, the United States has a different practice in place where we don't limit the hours worked by employees, and we're the country in the world that has the longest annual average working hours per employee at 1,880 hours per employee on average. So of course, some employees work many more hours than that, some work less. And our second competitor right behind us is Ireland, with an average of 1,802 hours worked per employee. And so when you average it out, that's quite a bit of work. And of course, like I said, we don't have caps overall in the United States that say an employer can only allow their employee to work, for example, 32 or 35 hours a week. So when we think about this classification of exempt employee versus non-exempt employee, and lots of times, just to pause here too, the idea of an exempt employee, I hear people calling that a salaried employee. And so let's make sure that we have some shared verbiage here. An exempt employee is an employee that is paid the same rate of pay each week, regardless of the number of hours that they work. And what that means specifically is that if they work overtime or more than 40 hours in a week, they are exempt from overtime rules. So you do not have to pay an exempt employee overtime if they work more than 40 hours per week. And when we're talking about non-exempt employees, we're talking about the fact that they are not exempt from the overtime rules, and any hours above and beyond 40 in a work week need to be paid at a minimum of time and a half their regular hourly rate. So we'll get back to those pay calculations momentarily, but let's talk about how we classify our exempt employees. And there are three main considerations. The first thing that we need to think about is how much the employee is paid in salary. So for employees to be considered exempt from overtime, they have to meet the minimum salary requirement. In addition to the salary requirement, it's important to consider how the pay is calculated for each employee in a pay week, and how do we pay them in the pay period. And so we'll take a look at that a little bit more when we talk about minimum wage and overtime and things like that. And most importantly, we have to consider the duties that the employee is engaged in their day-to-day work. And so we have to execute what's called a duties test. And so we want to take a look at the type of responsibilities that we've assigned to a particular employee on a regular basis. What do they do on a daily basis? What's their everyday look like? What are their major responsibilities? And if they are in the practice of engaging in the right kind of duties, then as long as their pay is calculated on a salary basis and it meets the minimum requirement for exempt employees' pay, which is $455 per week, then you're on good ground to say that your employee is exempt. So let's go ahead and dig in a little bit deeper. Okay, so exempt employees, let's think about this here. When we take the time to analyze which types of positions might be eligible for an exemption from overtime, we commonly see people in executive positions being exempt from overtime. So earning their salary each pay period based on their weekly pay, regardless of how many hours they work. We also see managers and directors of departments and programs. They are also commonly classified as exempt employees. We also see learned professionals, doctors, lawyers, teachers, accountants, and other types of business administrators, those who administer programs for a business or have responsibility over an entire program within a business or an agency. We see that these positions also qualify for an exemption under different rules that are classified under the Fair Labor Standards Act. And so there are several different types of exemptions, and these are the titles that are used in the Department of Labor's website. And so when we think about whether or not we can pay an employee a salary and exempt them from overtime also, it's important that they do fall into one of these categories. So the executive exemption, administrative exemption, learned professional, computer employees, outside salesperson exemption, or maybe a highly compensated employee exemption. Each of these is broken down, and there's kind of a yes or no test that you can conduct for each of them. And so if it's of interest to you to analyze a particular position, that's something that you can do using what we call the white collar exemption worksheets. And so if your organization could benefit from that type of information or a deeper dive into different positions and whether or not, for example, your office manager might be eligible for an administrative exemption, we can look specifically at that, and we can help you walk through a series of questions that will help you to identify whether or not that person would be comfortably situated in an exempt position and therefore paid their straight salary, maybe no overtime, regardless of the amount of hours worked. So exemption categories, again, can come from a few different areas, but remember that the responsibilities that an employee is taking on a day-to-day basis are the main factor that help us to determine whether or not somebody is exempt from overtime. And what I'm saying there is, for example, I'll have a client call me, we'll do a strategy session, and we'll talk about a position that they pay just salary for, they call it, right? So they'll say, well, I have a receptionist, and we pay her $600 a week, and that's her salary. And it's just $600 a week, regardless if she's at her desk for 36 hours or 48 hours a week. You know, we don't count it. She's a salaried employee. And so at that point, it's important to take a look at her duties and say, gosh, well, is she responsible for making certain types of decisions in the business that would put her in a position to pass the duties test, maybe for an administrative exemption. And so again, the exemption can be decided upon based on a combination of the salary that is paid, so no less than $455 per week, how you calculate pay, whether it's hourly or on a salary basis, and then most importantly, the type of duties and responsibilities that your employee is engaged in on a regular basis. So most employees in the United States are actually non-exempt employees. And these employees really prop up our local businesses and our small businesses across the board. And non-exempt employees are those employees that are engaged in the types of duties and responsibilities, job titles that I've got running down the right side of your screen right now. So we have personal service providers, different types of technicians and installation techs and things like that, laborers, people that install carpet, things like that, kind of those types of jobs, support staff and program coordinators, and then customer service associates, retail cashiers, those types of positions are non-exempt positions, which means that we have to consider on a very consider and measure on a close daily basis the hours that these employees are working. And so some of the things that we think about specifically when we are considering how to pay non-exempt employees are things like minimum wage and overtime. We have to think about travel time or time spent traveling from location to location for our non-exempt employees. We want to think about how to pay for meetings and trainings. There's also consideration to be made around the topic of rest periods, meal periods, and breaks. And then just overall, how do we determine if something is what we call compensable time? What's the bottom line standard? So we'll talk about each of those coming up right here. So a quick pop quiz for you. So you can just pause and grab your phone and take a look at Google or whatever your favorite search engine is. But I want you to stop and have just a moment to figure out if you can answer this question. So what is the current federal minimum wage? The current federal minimum wage. So just take one more minute to grab a pen and a paper, see what you can come up with. All right. Okay, so federal minimum wage right now, and today it's July of 2019, it's $7.25 per hour, and your state may have a higher minimum wage depending on your state laws. And so it's important to kind of keep up to date. And for example, in Arizona, where I am, we have a minimum wage that is on its way up to $12 an hour for next year. And we've had increases over the last few years. And so we have to stay closely aware of the rules and regulations as they change. So lots of states have minimum wages above the $7.25 federal minimum wage, and some individual cities even have ordinances that control the minimum wage. So it's very important to take a look at your state and your local rules for determining minimum wage. Okay, a common question that I get about how to pay employees, our non-exempt employees, again, not our salaried people, not our managers, not our program directors, that sort of thing, but our non-exempt employees. Maybe they're service workers that travel from one home to another during the day to execute different duties and tasks. It's important to start out by making sure that we all understand that, of course, travel time from home to the office or home to the first assignment location for the day is not compensable. That's commute time, we call it. However, once an employee arrives to the work location, whether it's an office or a client's home or any type of, any location that they've been assigned to complete work, and then they go to another off-site location to either meet with another client or perform other duties, or then they go to the office, the time traveling between the first work location and the next work location is likely compensable. So we don't ask employees to clock out and travel from one place to the next if they're only traveling for work in between once their day has started. Sometimes employees run errands for work, and this is a common question that I've come across in the last 20 years that I've been working with small business owners and operators. So it's important to remember that if you have an employee at a work location and you send them out to the store to pick up some cupcakes for the office birthday party, if your employee is a non-exempt employee who's performing that task, it's very important to remember that that is compensable on the clock time. Another topic that comes up very frequently with regard to non-exempt employees' pay is whether or not we, as small business leaders and owners, whether we have to pay for meetings and trainings. And so the U.S. Department of Labor has set out for us 4 sort of conditions that need to be met. And if all 4 of these conditions are met, then you do not have to pay your employee for training and meeting time. But if any of these conditions is not met, then the training or meeting time is absolutely paid time, compensable time. So the first one says the employee voluntarily attends the training course or the meeting. So if it's voluntary, then it might be unpaid time. If it also isn't directly related to their job, and if the employee is not performing any type of work that is productive for the business during the training, and if the training is given outside of regular business hours. So that's a pretty tough test to pass. And so normally, when an employer is asking their employees to attend a training or complete a training session, a webinar, or something that is a live hosted event, we're going to have to think long and hard about the time that will need to be paid for that. And so as I work to craft policies and practices with our clients, we often craft training policies that dictate how much training time employees will have available to them, who will pay for different courses, what that benefit looks like, and how they should track their time even when they attend those trainings. So meeting and training time, it's likely paid time unless all of the conditions listed on this slide are met. And just as a quick side note, you always have access to these slides in your attendee control panel. So you have a handout drop-down that allows you to look at the documents that I'm sharing with you during the session. You can grab those at any time during the webinar, but you do have these slides that I'm sharing with you today, and that's also where you're going to get your sample telecommute policy later when we talk about that. All right, so to keep moving along here, rest and meal periods, there is no federal law that says that employees have to receive rest breaks or meal breaks. And there is, however, a federal safety regulation, OSHA, that you've probably heard of, the OSHA Act, that does require employers to provide safe and healthy work environments. And so in my day-to-day practice of human resources and business operations leadership, I know that it's absolutely true that when employees are allowed to rest and take breaks during the day, that is a way to increase safety at work and decrease accidents and incidents related to safety. So although there's no federal wage and hour law that says that rest periods, breaks, or lunches or anything like that are absolutely required, it's probably good safety practice that if you have employees on the clock for 3 or 4 hours, that they are given a period of time to come off the job and take a quick break, a paid break. When we think about an unpaid break, we call those bona fide meal periods, and those are typically more than 30 minutes long. And in order for your employee to not be paid during that time, we have to make sure that they come off the clock completely and that they do no work for that period of time. So let's talk about a receptionist again. If you have a receptionist in the front office that helps you to maintain your great customer service and greet your visitors and customers, the receptionist can't take a lunch at her desk if she's still greeting customers during that time, or if he's still answering the phone for the business during that lunchtime. So employees need to be completely relieved of their duties so that they can be off the clock. And employees that are at their desk taking lunch and still reading email and checking voicemail and greeting customers, that's really paid time. And so we have to make sure that we're managing our workflows so that we can relieve them of their responsibilities and then they can come off the clock. And just generally speaking, if you have employees taking 10 and 15-minute breaks in order to stay safe and energized and healthy at work, those are usually paid breaks, compensable breaks. And again, lots of different states have different rules about whether or not breaks must be paid in that state. And so it's important to take a look at those state regulations. And again, that's something that we are absolutely happy to help you locate. So the bottom line here is that time is money for employees. And if we are allowing our employees to work, they're doing something that benefits the company or benefits clients, benefits the employer overall, that's paid time. And so if we want someone to take a break so that we can control for overtime and labor costs, then we have to be compassionate about it and tactful about it, but we got to let them know that it's time to come off the clock, it's time to step away from their desk so that they are able to really take a break. And again, on the other end, you're thinking about as a small business owner, the fact that you are also controlling your overtime costs and things like that. So time is money for our non-exempt employees. Again, exempt employees, those who are paid a salary and are exempt from overtime, they might work 8, 9, 10 hours in a day and their salary stays the same. But for our non-exempt employees, we have to be careful that any time that they are working on behalf of the employer or the company, that they are tracking that time and they are paid for that time. So here's a quick pop quiz. And so you're welcome to get a little pen and paper out and just do a little true false with me. So the first question that I have is, would checking your work email or voicemail while at home be compensable if you are a non-exempt employee? So do we have to pay non-exempt employees for the time that they spend checking work email or voicemail while at home? Yes or no? All right, and the answer to that is typically yes, that unless it's just nominal time, like a minute here and there, we do have to make sure that we're asking our non-exempt employees to track their administrative time and report that on a weekly basis. And what I also see small business leaders doing is creating policies that say, hey, we may have access to all these different types of technology and systems, but we are telling you that it's our policy that you don't check your work email at home, or that you don't check it when you're supposed to be off the clock, because that helps you as a small business control this responsibility to pay for all the time worked. But it also helps in other ways when we think about trying to keep our employees from burning out on the job. And that's not a wage and hour compliance issue, but it's another topic that I talk with clients a lot about, that we want to create systems and policies and procedures that help support the long-term success of our employees. And when employees are checking email and working, all hours of the day and don't feel like they can take a break and be away from work, that can be detrimental to their mental health and to their success and happiness on the job. So a nice policy that outlines when they should be checking email and if it's allowed to check while at home or off-site, and then how to report that time, super important. Okay, here's another one that comes up pretty often. So again, lots of really cool different types of businesses out there, small businesses have their employees out and about in the community. And so is the time spent mapping out a route from one client's location to the next, is that time planning compensable time? Should we be asking employees to record it, and is that time that has to be paid? So your employee is mapping out a plan or a route that will get them from one client assignment to the next. So is that paid time or not? All right, and to jump right in with some information, that time is likely compensable time. So when we have employees that are preparing to be successful on the job, that are completing duties that will help them to get from one place to the other, and overall it benefits the company, benefits the employer, that is going to be time that is paid, and especially if it's happening in between jobs. So if your employee goes to job number 1 of the day, and before leaving job number 1, they spend 5 minutes getting ready for job number 2, mapping it out, checking the traffic, things like that, then that 5 minutes is compensable. And let's say they have 3 different jobs during the day, and so they're checking for 10 or even 15 minutes getting prepared. All of that time is compensable, and it's important to remember that that time adds up. And so as we are determining what our labor budgets are, our payroll budgets, it's important to remember that if you have employees in a non-traditional, like non-office setting, that you want to think about the fact that you will need to pay your employees for the time that they are spending in administrative type duties and tasks. All right, well, thanks for playing the pop quiz with me. And we'll close this piece off here by talking about common violations that we come across. So the first most common violation that we see with regard to the Fair Labor Standards Act in small businesses is employers not paying for what we'll call unauthorized overtime. So an employee in this situation is working a few extra hours, or a few extra, minutes at the end of each day, and over the course of the week, they end up going over 40 hours, and they've worked 41.25 hours. And so you've got 40 hours of straight time, 1.25 hours of overtime, and you've decided that you're not going to pay that time because you didn't authorize it and your employee did not request permission to do that. And so even if you have a policy that says employees should request permission to work overtime, if the employee doesn't follow that policy, but they did work that extra hour and a quarter of overtime, that time still has to be paid at the overtime rate. And what you've got on your hands is a disciplinary issue. It's not a compensation question. And so we have to be careful to not get into a tug of war there about compensation. So we have to pay the employee for the time they spent on the clock, whether or not we think they made the most efficient, best use of their time or not. We have to address their performance and their decisions on the job through a disciplinary process, not through their paycheck, okay? The next piece that we see small business leaders specifically tripping over here is automation in deducting for meal breaks. So lots of different payroll and timekeeping systems out there will let employers automatically include a half-hour break for their employees or an hour-long break. And so if you're using that feature in your timekeeping or payroll system, which does save us some time in tracking employees' work and calculating payroll, it's important to make sure that you have a policy and a procedure in place that your employees are aware of and they understand how to use so that they are able to report any type of variance from the standard meal break. So if an employee is set to take an automatic 30-minute meal break in the system and something comes up, and let's say maybe a patient comes late for an appointment and they're a medical assistant, and so they're asked to work through their lunch period, they're going to need to know who to go to report that exception so that that additional 30 minutes can be added back into their time. And so make sure you have a policy and a practice for that, because where we have these blanket systems that are automatically deducting for 30 and 60-minute meal breaks, we do find that it makes it difficult for the employee to go back and edit without trouble the time that they did work. And we know that in order to meet customer and client and patient needs, that it is important that employees be flexible and that they ebb and flow with the needs of the client. And so we want them to be able to do that. And we also want to make sure that we pay them in alignment with all of these regulations. So let's move on from talking about the minimum wage and the hours worked topic. Let's talk about a couple other odds and ends that come up as really common questions related to pay for non-exempt and exempt employees in small business. So timing of pay, how often do I need to pay my employees? Is it every other week? Is it weekly? Is it monthly? And so the answer to this is that each state has its own regulations related to the timing of employee paychecks. And so we have to either hop over to the Department of Labor's website, or you can shoot me a question in an email and I can find it for you. How often in my state do we have to pay employees? So I gave an example here that is my home state where we're based in Arizona. Arizona has a state regulation that says that employees have to be paid 2 times or more per month. So semi-monthly pay is required. And the paydays cannot fall more than 16 days apart. So that's our state rule. Each state has different rules. And on that note, another topic that comes up quite often is what about last paychecks or final pay for employees? So again, each state has adopted its own regulations related to final pay. And in some instances, the final pay rule may depend on whether the employee terminated voluntarily or involuntarily. So did they resign their position or were they fired, right? And so again, for example, in Arizona, if an employee is involuntarily terminated or let go, their final pay for their hours worked, including any overtime that's due to them, needs to be paid within 7 days of their termination. And on the other hand, if they terminate voluntarily, maybe they resign or they retire, their final pay is delivered on the next scheduled payday. And to the extent that you haven't yet been able to calculate a bonus or some sort of commission or something like that, that can be paid out at a future date as long as that's your normal practice. Like maybe today is the last day of the month and your numbers come in on the last day of the month and commission is paid on the 5th of the next month. Well, if you don't have the numbers to calculate someone's final pay, their commission, then that's okay. Maybe they just need to pay paid their salary within the time frame that is prescribed by the state, and you are allowed to spend some time calculating your bonus and commission and things like that. Or if you have a practice of paying out vacation or PTO time, that can also typically be paid out on a separate check. So these final pay rules really are related to people's final salary, their final hours worked, and final overtime. Deductions from wages are another point of question and concern for small business leaders. And so we have to, now we're going to kind of pause and think back into the frame of exempt employees. So deductions from wages for exempt employees are normally not permitted when they're related to the hours worked. So salary is due for weeks in which the work was performed generally. That's the general rule, okay? Now, if an exempt employee signs up for health insurance or a 401k or something like that, of course you can deduct for programs that benefit your employee and that they voluntarily enroll in. That's no problem at all. However, when we talk about deducting from wages for things like time that isn't worked, the employee had to leave early on Tuesday and Wednesday in order to go to the doctor and pick their child up from school the next day even. So they've worked a partial day. Well, normally exempt employees that work partial days are typically paid for that whole day, so they might still get their salary for that week. You may be asking them, though, to apply some paid time off to cover that time, right? So they're still getting their salary, but they've used some time off. Once an employee who is an exempt employee exhausts their time off balance, maybe it's PTO, maybe it's vacation time or sick time, that you have a bank for them, and then they exhaust it all, they use it all. It is okay to, in the future, if they are off for an entire day, a whole day, you can deduct for whole day absences. So these are pretty tricky, specific situations, so we won't spend a ton of time in this piece of the conversation, but if you ever find that you have a salaried exempt employee who's taking time off and it's partial days, you might want to give us a buzz and we can talk about the very specific rules that are found in the Fair Labor Standards Act that relate back to exempt employee deductions from wages. So generally, salaried employees get their salary pay regardless of how many hours they work. If they're gone in full day increments, though, you might be able to deduct for that time away. Deductions from pay for non-exempt employees are also often found in your state regulations. So states may prohibit certain types of deductions. For example, we are not allowed to deduct for lost or broken equipment in certain states. So if your employee breaks something at work and you want to charge it back to them on their paycheck, that's not always a possibility. Although, the cost of doing business is sometimes frustrating when employees break things or lose things. We aren't always able to turn around and deduct that from an employee's pay to try to recoup that cost. Another common payroll deduction that I do see small business owners trying to make, and it may be permitted in your state or it may not, we have to check that out, are deductions for cash shortages. So where your employees are collecting cash payments for different types of goods and services, if you find that your employee is short in their drawer or in their till, you may or may not be able to recoup that cash shortage. And so it's important to, again, take a look and review those state laws to be sure. And a best practice, generally speaking, is that it's a great idea to have all deductions specifically authorized in writing. So even if, let's say that you have an employee that purchases goods from your business, so you are a home remodeling company and you sell carpet and your employee wants to buy carpet directly from you, and so you allow them to do that and you sell them the carpet at a certain cost and they want to pay you back via payroll deduction. Well, that's okay. You can absolutely do that. Maybe they want to pay it back over 2 months too to make it a little bit more affordable. So you are going to set up a deduction plan for them and have them sign off and authorize in writing that you are going to deduct from their pay, let's call it $750 per pay period for the next 4 pay periods. something like that, right? Whatever it is, let's make sure that we get it authorized in writing from the employee so that there's never an allegation that you withheld their pay without their permission. There's an interesting little bit of guidance from the Department of Labor that I did want to pop in and share here too, because lots of small business leaders ask that their employees wear uniforms. And so when employers require their employees to wear a uniform, the maintenance of the uniform is considered to be a business expense for the employer, generally speaking, especially if it needs some sort of special care or treatment. So if you have an employee uniform that needs to be dry cleaned, it's a good idea to really consider having a program where your employees drop off their uniforms and then you send them out for cleaning and bring them back and forth for them. Now, if the employer requires the employee to bear the cost of maintaining or purchasing their uniforms, it's really important to calculate this out and make sure that after those types of deductions are made, that your employees are not making less than minimum wage on a per pay period basis. And so you can calculate that at the federal level. We do often ask folks to take a look at their state level too, that when an employee is like buying a new shirt or something like that from the company, that after you deduct for that new shirt, maybe it's $10 or $12, that they don't somehow drop below minimum wage for that particular week. So if there are specific questions about that, or you'd like to play out a scenario for your business, that's a great reason to email in follow-up to this session and let us know that you have a pressing question. So as we kind of turn the corner and start to wind down our time together today, I wanted to just share this list of record-keeping requirements with you. And again, this is requirement that is found under the Fair Labor Standards Act. For non-exempt employees, we have to keep certain types of payroll records. And this is regardless of whether your employees are paid hourly or piece rate or project rate or job rate. If you have a non-exempt employee, someone who is eligible for overtime when it's all said and done, we have to make sure that we keep track of the items bulleted on our screen right now. So time and day of the week when the employee's work week begins. So is it at midnight on Sundays? We need to know the hours that they work each day, so how many total hours. And then we need to compute a total for the work week. How many hours did they work from Sunday at midnight till Saturday at 11:59 p.m. And then the total daily or weekly straight time earnings, and then any overtime for the work week. And again, at the federal level, that's time over 40 hours physically worked in the week. And then we need to calculate additions and deductions from wages, and that includes tax information. So we have to have our calculations for taxes lined out, and then total wages paid, the gross and the net for your employee each pay period, and the date of the payment and the pay period covered by the payment. So what's your check date and what was your pay period? So that should be included as well in your records. Oftentimes, almost all of this information is included in a pay stub, so that makes it easy. And you may also want to develop some pay policies that you include in your handbook or an employee reference guide that help to outline things like when the work week begins, so that employees understand how overtime is calculated, and that helps to minimize confusion and questions that they might have if they think that they earned overtime, but based on the 7-day work week, maybe they didn't. So that's an important piece here on payroll record keeping for non-exempt employees for small businesses. For exempt employees, the requirements are a little bit different. So we want to make sure that we are tracking the time and day of the week when the employee's work week begins, so that's consistent. But then it changes right away, and we just need to keep track of the total salary or other earnings that an employee has on the books each week. So it maybe is their base salary and commissions for the week. And then we want to make sure that we keep track of additions and deductions from their wages. And again, deducting for time worked maybe less than 40 hours, that's a tricky deduction to make. So let's talk about that before you're engaging in that practice. And then we want to keep track of total wages paid for each pay period and the date of the payment and the pay period dates as well. So the big difference here is that for our non-exempt employees, we had to keep track of the hours worked each day, the total hours of each work week, straight time, and overtime. For our exempt folks, we are just keeping track of their total salary. We are not tracking their hours. All right, and based on different state regulations, you might have to offer access to current or former employees. You might have to offer them access to different types of employment records. And so things like hours worked and paycheck information. If they were exposed to some sort of toxic material or physical agent, sometimes we have to provide that information or medical records, and that's under, again, the federal OSHA guidelines and standards. And then lots of times employees are looking for information like dates of hire and dates of separation from the company, and sometimes we are required to provide that as well. So with all of this information behind us, how do we maintain compliance? So it's important to have a plan moving forward. So this webinar, this session, hopefully has proven to be a great introduction to wage and hour compliance. There are millions of moving parts as it relates to payment for work for employees in small business. And so how do you move forward from here? So we'll become educated on the regulations and we'll stay up to date. So check in with us often. And if you have specific questions about how to be compliant within your business, ask, reach out and let us know. We'll also work to craft policies and train employees on policies related to timekeeping, payroll reporting, how to deal with errors on pay records and things like that. We want to also think about developing a policy regarding the use of mobile devices for your non-exempt workers, or also policies related to telecommuting. And so that's one of the samples that you have in your handouts today. And the telecommuting policy addresses how work is done and how it's reported and recorded so that you don't have to worry about your employees claiming that they did work offsite that they weren't paid for. So that we have some policies to develop there. And then develop and stick to policies for these different situations too, where employees might be completing offsite work like at a conference or at an event, so that when you send them out into the community, they know how they're paid for that time. And then have your employees copy their managers or their supervisors if they're engaging in work-related communication, especially if it's off-site or if it's after hours. And that way, just for the purpose of time tracking and understanding efficiencies, you can have all the information that you need to maintain compliance and pay your employees as they should be paid in accordance with the rules, and also manage your budgets and manage your business so that you can have long-term success and sustainability in your business. So in your handouts, downloads here, you do have this collection of slides available to you. And when you're in the live slides, you will have access to links. And so these are live links in your handouts, in your PDF packet. So definitely download those slides and visit the sites that are there for you to provide you with additional information about the different rules and regulations. And of course, if you're not interested in digging through the Department of Labor's website and you have a question, you're welcome to reach out to our team in order to gather some more details. So I invite you to follow up from this session with your questions. You can reach out via email or phone call. You can find us on our website at hranswers.org. And we are here to help you to build and maintain success in small business human resources. And we can't wait to hear what questions you have. So thank you for joining us, and we hope this has been helpful. We hope you found at least one new idea that you can take into your small business to maintain compliance with wage and hour rules. Thanks again for joining us, and have a spectacular day.